hitman to do it. He didn't want to do it himself. He went out and hired some, deadbeat to do the killing, and the deadbeat was duly arrested shortly thereafter and executed. But the family of the butcher was outraged that nobody had done anything to the member of the society who had hired him. So he hired another deadbeat, Tony Turco, to go and take care of the Black Hand guy. And Tony gathered up a couple of his friends, duly committed that murder, and then started a murder for hire group. And it was a catch-as-catch-can thing. He went out and he held up people around Easton. He held up one lady who thought had a bunch of money because she'd been doing business for years. They tied her up and gagged her, and they were so inefficient at their gagging that they strangled her. She died. So they would take on jobs for anybody who would pay their fee. And of course they had done this silk hijacking. The actual facts of the silk hijacking were that they were a week late. They got several $1,000s out of the truck, but the truck they wanted had been going through there 1 week earlier and had something like $60,000 aboard, which would have been a much better job. These were not the organized mobsters that we think of today. It was, as I say, an entrepreneurial business. Come to 1922, and all of a sudden the boom is lowered. The feds announce that to their agents in Philadelphia that they're going to run a raid on Easton. So they all get on the train one morning, and they get up to Phillipsburg, cross the bridge, and start raiding the speakeasies. Now, there was an interesting problem here. The speakeasies weren't ready for this. People were arrested. Beer was found. Alcohol was actually located in these places. They had been tipped off ahead of time by telephone, but they just didn't believe it because they had a couple of years of running wide open. They'd paid both the Republican and the Democrat parties, one editorial said, and so they felt that they were safe. What was going on? But nonetheless, folks were arrested. There were no arrests at the production plants. Nobody tried to catch the brewers in the middle of the night. And the big brewers actually had the word, and that was the source of the telephone information to the speakeasies, who simply just thought it was the big guys, throwing their weight around. The net result, of course, was that most of the people who were caught were never indicted, or if indicted, they were acquitted when they went to trial because the jury simply refused to convict anybody of anything. And most of them were let go. The speakeasies were back in operation within a day. And actually a lot of the evidence never made it down to Philadelphia for trial because the trucks were basically stopped by mobs or broke down, and the contents in the back were stolen or in some cases just broken up and run down the gutter. So it was very clear that nobody wanted these outside feds to be doing what they were doing. They had another go in 1923, but it was pretty clear they weren't getting anywhere with this technique. So they decided to attack the breweries, and particularly the Sites Brewery. They thought they would see if they could catch them in the middle of the night. So they sent a posse of 3, R.J. Adina and 2 deputies. They went in at about 2 in the morning. Sure enough, the plant was in full operation, brewing beer, putting it in kegs, getting it ready for the trucks that were going to roll. The 3 of them found they had about 70 people in the plant. It was a sizable operation, and they were having trouble controlling all of this. Meantime, the head of the plant, L.R. Cohen, called down to City Hall, and he asked for police protection from the Easton police because there were people who were holding up his plant claiming to be federal agents. The police duly arrived and found that Mr. Adina had brought his card with him to show that he was a federal agent, but the two other guys didn't have any identification at all, so they were arrested and taken to jail, which left Mr. Adina and one pistol to control all of these 70 people because the Easton cops weren't going to help him. He did his best. He corralled about 15 people in the keg room, and all of a sudden, as he was doing that, ammonia fumes started coming into the keg room because they used ammonia to fumigate and kill the rats and so forth during the time when the plant wasn't in operation. And so somebody had turned on the system. They had to get out. They had to go into the yard. He managed to hold on to the plant head, Mr. Cohen, and a couple of other people. He did indict Cohen, finally. They had a little trouble getting the evidence because it miraculously got broken up and run down the gutter. But he did get enough beer to get an indictment. However, the judge told him honestly that he didn't think any jury would convict on this evidence, and nothing was going to happen. They had another go. In 1926, they sent a guy named Welsh with credentials, and he actually caught a truck that came out of the Sites plant during the day. He jumped on the running board on the side of the truck, produced his pistol, and told the driver to stop. The driver, however, noticed that Mr. Welsh's hand was shaking so badly that he didn't think he was going to. He knew how to use his pistol and didn't think he would fire, so he just drove on. As he did, Welsh saw a sanitary worker walking down the side of the road, called for help, yelled that he was deputized on the spot, and between the two of them, they managed to intimidate the truck driver into stopping. About that time, the contents of the back of the truck were attacked by a mob of people who started taking off the evidence and razzing the two officers, and then they broke up some of the beer kegs, and it was running down the gutter. So the two agents ran to the back of the truck to protect their evidence, and at that point the truck driver took off. The sanitary worker complained loudly that he'd fallen down in the gutter, he'd been tripped, and he tore his pants. L.R. Cohen solicitously put an ad in the paper that said that he would buy the guy a new pair of pants, and that was the end of the incident. Except that the feds were really outraged now at what was going on in Easton. The head of the operation in Philadelphia, a guy named Fetterman, sent the agents to close down the Sites brewery. They pretty much came in with guns drawn and a massive attack, and they did get it closed in the end of 1926. However, it was reopened. It was reopened by 1929, and it was part of a syndicate. Now, at that time, they didn't know. The public was unaware of what was going on. However, we do know from subsequent evidence that it became part of the empire of Maxey Hassel. Maxey Hassel was the guy who organized all of the breweries on the entire East Coast, and he was protected by gangsters in New York City, especially the Dutch Schultz mob. The reason we know is because Maxey raised his prices to Dutch just a little more than Dutch wanted. Dutch, of course, was crazy. He would kill anybody, so he had Maxey blown away. And when they organized the estate, they found that there was evidence that he owned all these breweries all over the East Coast. So it came to light that the Sites Brewery had been part of that empire. So it went from an entrepreneurial operation to part of a very highly organized and integrated operation. And we see evidence of that going on in a lot of these industries. how do you organize brothels? What happens with brothels? It seems like an entrepreneurial business, the archetypal entrepreneurial business, right? And probably one of the oldest. What was going on there? Well, we get some intimation of what was going on from police reports, and we have to read between the lines a bit. But in 1927, there was a racket that, there was a frantic call from a South Bethlehem brothel. The head of the brothel was a lady named Annabelle, more of her later, and she wasn't on the premises. One of her people called the police and asked for protection because a gunman was there holding everybody up and shaking them down for their money, their valuables, and what have you. And this wasn't good for business. An officer went to stop the gunman, and the gunman blew him away, was shot and killed, which is why the thing was carried in the paper. There was a hue and a cry because a policeman had been killed, and they went searching for the gunman, of course, who were nowhere to be found. At about the same time, 1928 really at its height, a group of criminals started work in Easton. They featured the head of the gang, who was a dapper gent by the name of, the popular name of Jack Buckles. And his first lieutenant was Tony Testa, known popularly as the Bomb Maker. But one of his principal lieutenants was a gunman from Philadelphia, whose proper name was Salviano Damatore, but nobody wanted to do that, so he was popularly called Johnny the Wop. Johnny was a bit of a piece of work, apparently. He took offense at everything, and had no hesitation in drawing his gun and using it, and basically wasn't caught at it, at least not enough to put him in jail. Well, let's drop back. There were a series of these robberies, gunpoint robberies, in brothels around the Easton area. Now, the principal target of this was two sort of institutions, if you will. One was the William Penn Inn, which is where Blue is located now. And it was run by a pair of gentlemen, one of whom was the husband of Annabelle, who had been the head of the brothel in South Bethlehem. They opened another, more modern establishment by taking over the Black Horse Inn, which is where the bacon place was for a while there down on south of Easton on Delaware Drive. They put in slot machines, a lot of betting material. It turned, making it quite the night spot. They also focused on the strip north of Easton, primarily up Bushkill Drive. There was the Ethel Inn, which was across from Stocker's Collision. I talked with Mr. Stocker before he died, and as a teenage boy, he lived in the area, and he used to see the Ethel Inn was originally a brothel to the public, but it later became a rest stop once a month for the girls, and they were rotated in and apparently sunbathed along the Bushkill in the summer. And of course, a teenage boy with an upper bedroom, hey, this was great stuff. The Pines was a little bit farther up Bushkill Drive. Then there was another one up in Tatamy, where the entrance, where the spring house is, just before you get to the entrance to Tatamy there. There's an enormous parking lot next to the spring house. I assure you it was not for getting water out of the spring house. There was a brothel that was located there. and it was originally the Blue Moon, and then it was updated to the Bushkill Manor. More of it later. There was another brothel on Sullivan Trail, where at the crossroads with Euler Avenue, called the Red Onion. The Delaware Inn was on Mud Run Road, very close to where you get to the Delaware. And then as you went up Delaware Drive, there were more, the First Hotel and so forth. So these robbers seem to have made a circuit of hitting these brothels with gunmen and holding up everybody and taking their stuff. And in 1928, they made the mistake, apparently, of holding up the Delaware Inn and not only taking stuff from the patrons, but also robbing the owner, or the proprietor, who was a guy named Coleman, and they took his watch. And he apparently was incensed and decided to do something about this threat. The something that he did was to apparently organize the different brothels into a syndicate. They would protect themselves from the robbers. The Red Onion and later the Bushkill Inn actually put a machine gun nest on top of the brothel to mow down anybody that was going to be a problem, with signal lights, you know, going up and down to if there was bad stuff going on. This organization became a bit of a problem. It is an open question as to who was responsible, but Johnny the Wop had pissed off too many people, and in the middle of 1928 was blown away by 4 guys wielding shotguns at the Black Horse Inn. They chased him all over the place. He was hard to kill, apparently, but he finally was, they corralled him by the basement stairs and shot into him repeatedly with the shotguns and then with their pistols, and that was finally the end of Johnny. Tony Buckles and Tony Tester were arrested. They were identified by the 2 guys who owned the brothels down in the area. They identified them as being part of the gang that had done the shooting. There had been other people in the inn, and they hadn't made such a good identification. Everybody was jumping out the windows and trying to get away. But because this was such a visible thing in the press, the police went and they basically rounded up everybody. Everybody who'd been in the inn, everybody who'd been on the phone with anybody in the inn, anybody who was walking on the street. They rounded them up, and some of them applied for habeas corpus, saying they'd been grilled and beat up by the police for interrogation, and they were innocent bystanders, and the police had absolutely no evidence of anything, and the judge contemptuously vindicated the police and said, you know, have at it. Do whatever you have to do to anybody. So that was the nature of police work at the time. Jake Buckles was put on trial at the end of 1928 for the murder. He was acquitted. He was acquitted in part on evidence of an alibi. It was claimed that part of the problem between Buckles and Johnny was they had shared their own particular prostitute at the William Penn, and she testified that Buckles had been with her at the time of the shooting. The theory of the defense, however, was that Coleman had Johnny killed. That Johnny had been busy with the Black Horse, that Coleman had included in the syndicate the 2 guys who owned the string of brothels in the south area, the south side, and that they were the ones who'd actually sent the 4 shotgun-wielding people to blow away Johnny. And the jury bought that story. 1929, the holdup gang tried again, and they held up in succession in one night, all down the brothels on the just north of Easton. And in each case, the brothels were prepared. Apparently, phone calls had gone out from the Delaware Inn, and they called the other brothels, and everybody was ready. And the police were called, and the police went right behind, and they never did actually catch up with them, but they cut down the time they had in each inn. And of course, by the time the police arrived, all the slot machines and so on had disappeared, and everything was purely innocent. The syndicate was clearly in operation. Now, whether operated by this man Coleman, who may have been a myth, or whether by somebody else, something was going on. And indeed, we know, because of what Stocker had seen at the Ethel Inn, that it was being used not just by its